Well, hello, everybody. I'm here to talk to you all today about the literary period in English literature that we call the Restoration and the 18th century, or sometimes it's known as the Restoration and Enlightenment. All right. So, first, a little bit of a recap when we're talking about the English Renaissance. So, we can really start with that just briefly with the Wars of the Roses and the whole social unrest and mix ups that were going on there. Then the rise of the Tudor dynasty, starting with Henry VII, where they restored order, but did so by being, well, let's just say pretty autocratic and often rather brutal. The Tudors, beginning with Henry VIII and continuing on with his daughters Mary and Elizabeth, also had a major struggle with different with the source with the whole Reformation going on at that point, and with Henry breaking from the church, Mary returning to it, and then Elizabeth breaking with it again. And in between there was Henry's son, Edward, who didn't really reign because he was too young. But um, anyway, so going on after Elizabeth's death, the throne passed to her cousin, or more her cousin's son, James the First, and he reigned. He's the one that Jamestown in Virginia is named after, and I think we briefly mentioned him. Then it passes down to his son Charles, who Charles reigns for a while, but he's pretty incompetent and fickle as a ruler, and as a result, there's a major revolt and a civil war, and eventually Charles gets captured and his head gets chopped off by the forces of the parliamentarians. The parliament proves to be pretty incompetent as well, and so eventually this guy named Oliver Cromwell, who was the most important general, takes over as a sort of military dictator and runs the country much more competently, but no less brutally than the Stuarts before him. Eventually, when he dies, the major powers and some of the generals and such at the time invite back Charles the First's son, Charles the Second, and that really begins the time period that we're talking about. So, a couple things that are important to remember during this time is there's some major inventions during the Renaissance, the printing press, and there's also the huge opening of the New World and European exploration, which both of those really shake up a lot of accepted ideas and ideals at the time and awaken to a new world of possibilities, whether it's mass literacy through the printing press or, the New World for European settlement and all that took place with that. There's also the Reformation, which sort of breaks up what had been a relatively unified Western European culture. Not unified politically, there was wars and stuff like that between the different powers, but unified in the sense of they pretty well agreed on philosophically and religiously and that sort of thing, and saw themselves as part of a common culture, even though not politically united. With the Reformation, that pretty much breaks down, and you have warring Protestant and Catholic powers, not always on opposite sides. Sometimes you'll have Catholic powers that ally with Protestant ones, and so on. But you do have this breakup of the idea of there being a common culture and this idea of kind of rival cultures within Western Europe. And there's partly as a result of the Reformation and then some of these other technologies and exploration, stuff like that, you have a rise of nationalism, really more a rise of national powers in the form of absolute monarchs, not really nationalism in the modern sense so much. And you also have a rise of the commercial class that's happening at this same time. And so money and who has it is becoming more important than the old landed aristocracy in many cases, although the old landed aristocracy is still pretty powerful at this time. So massive changes, massive reorganizations, all this is going on during the Renaissance. And one thing that happens with the Restoration is during the parliamentarian period before the Restoration, when Charles II is brought back as king, uh, the dominant belief system had been what was known as Calvinism, which was, at that time at least, considered a pretty radical element of the Reformation. And the English Puritans that came to the New World were definitely of that persuasion. And they were even more anti Catholic, if you will, than the Church of England people that had come before. And so, with Charles II being restored, a lot of that sort of gets walked back. A lot of what was seen as the extremism of the Calvinist Puritan uh, belief system that had been, kind of championed by the parliamentarians. Anyway, so that kind of leads to what England was like at the beginning of what's known as this Restoration period. It's pretty well exhausted. They've had a lot of civil war. They've had a military dictatorship. During this time, the Black Plague comes back, and there's a huge fire that burns 2/3 of London. And so, so the England is in kind of a bad shape overall. And so, remember how I talked about at the end of the Wars of the Roses, people were just kind of, okay, just give us sort of some kind of stability. Well, there's a similar thing going on now after the English Civil War and all that upheaval. And so Charles II is seen as, by some, as a new Augustus. I mean, even his staunchest allies realize he's not anywhere near as brilliant as Caesar Augustus. He's a very witty guy, but he's not necessarily the most politically astute ever. And he makes a lot of compromises. He does manage to stay on his throne, unlike his father, so he's definitely brighter than his dad in that regard. But he's seen like Augustus in the sense that he ends a period of civil war, and there's a number of compromises that take place. So the king is able to regain the throne, and he has a fair amount of power, but he's not an absolute monarch, and never again will any English monarch be an absolute monarch. After all, nobody's just going to forget that there was a king who got his head chopped off because he stepped on too many toes. But we generally see this attitude in England of, we're really wary of radicals of any stripe. We're really wary of the radical pro-monarchists that would like to bring back an absolute monarchy, or the radical anti-monarchists. We're wary of the radical, say, pro-Catholic, pro-old-style religion forces, and we're really wary of the radical pro-Calvinist, Calvinist pro-anti-Catholic sort of side too. So not everybody, but a lot of people are really looking for a compromise between the two. So they do things that, or make the monarchists happy, like dig up Oliver Cromwell and chop off his corpse's head, as well as condemn to death some of the people who were responsible for chopping off Charles I's head. But it kind of stops there. They don't go in this radical purge of everybody that had been anti-monarchist, pro-parliamentarian. They get taken down a couple pegs, but they don't purge them really. And then on the other side, they actually bring, the Parliament retains a lot of its power. And then on the religious side, yes, he is a pro Church of England, kind of what we call more high church side of things, kind of, keeping the ceremonies and stuff like that. But there's this idea of really running strong in society that moderation is important, and that shows up in the literature of the time, which is really modeled after a lot of the classics of Roman literature, and emphasizing reason and moderation as opposed to, strong emotion and radicalism, which had been kind of prevalent in some of the older literature. So, as we said, Charles reinstitutes the Anglican Church, the official Church of England. He clamps down on some of the independent groups and the Calvinist groups and stuff like that, but not completely. He gives them the out where they can run off to the New World and a lot of them do, swell the population of Massachusetts and other places. And he doesn't persecute them to the level where they just like have no hope. So he just kind of tries to tamp them down somewhat. Um, when he dies, he has no legitimate heir. He had lots of mistresses, so he did have a number of kids, but none of them with his legal wife. And so that meant that the throne would pass to his brother, James II. James II had become a Catholic during his exile and was seen as too radically to that side, if you will, by a lot of people at the time. At first, they're kind of willing to let him go along and stay as king because it's thought that when he dies, his daughter will inherit the throne as Queen Mary, and she was a Protestant. So it's like, oh, okay, well, we'll just endure this interlude. But then James is remarried, and his second wife bears a son. They're like, oh, great. He's going to raise that kid Catholic, and then we're going to end up with Catholic monarchs, and none of us want that. At least most of the powers that be at the time were not happy with that idea. So they overthrow him. They deliberately allow him to escape because they don't want to make another royal martyr. But then they invite his daughter over, Queen Mary, and her husband, William, to be joint monarchs of England as William and Mary. And after that point, they make a law that all the monarchs of England have to be Anglicans. And that's actually still in place. Several of the Queen's descendants are excluded. Queen Elizabeth II, who just recently died, are excluded from succession because they're Catholic. So anyway, that's still actually the rule in England to this day. And you can see their pictures, by the way. Charles II is the one with the dark hair here, and his brother James is the one with the lighter colored hair. Most likely actually wigs, but anyway, you can see that. And it's known as the, quote, glorious revolution when they overthrow James, and William and Mary come in, and they have to agree to more limits on the king's power even. And so, I mean, while still pretty powerful, definitely their wings are trimmed somewhat from the times of the Tudors and kind of absolute monarchy, or at least getting close to it under the Tudor dynasty. And after William dies, his sister-in-law Anne takes over as Queen Anne, and then the line passes to some cousins that were in Germany at the time, and thus you get George the First, Second, and Third, and yeah, it's that George the Third that we know from the American Revolution. Okay, so some of the ideas at the time. The Enlightenment period, we're talking about kind of the later eras, later part of this era in some cases. Reason and moderation are very much prized, and we should run society, more or less like a well-tuned machine. The scientific revolution is taking place during this time, and so this way of seeing the world, and the early scientific revolution really popularizes this idea of the world as more or less a giant machine. So you have guys like Isaac Newton in the scientific side, and then Voltaire on more of the political, philosophical side, who champion this way of thinking. And as the second bullet point there indicates, that the real central question of society changes from why does this happen to how it happens. Like, we're not going to worry too much about the why this is here. We're going to just look at, okay, let's see how it works. And so kind of that rationalistic, mechanistic way of looking at the world becomes much more popular. Deism becomes popular at the time as a religious viewpoint. Deism says more or less God was a watchmaker, he made the world, and he left it ticking. And he doesn't really intervene in the world anymore, but we can look around at this great machine that he made and admire how it works really nice. But we're not going to worry too much about anything like divine revelation or doctrine or stuff like that. We're just going to kind of say, oh yeah, there was a God and he made the world, and kind of pretty much left it to its own devices. And that was a very popular idea at the time. A lot of the American founding fathers were, such as Thomas Jefferson, were pretty much deists, as well as Voltaire here and some of the other French philosophers. Newton was not. Newton was had his own religious system, which was somewhat odd, and he like wrote huge volumes on what he believed, the meaning of the Book of Revelations was and stuff like that, while also being one of the most prominent scientists of the time. But deism was pretty popular. All right, so theater, particularly in the earlier period that we're talking about, like in the 1660s through the 1680s, was super popular because one of the things that the Puritans under the Parliament had done was outlaw theaters and close them all down. So when Charles gets welcomed back as king, one of the first things he does is opens up those theaters. And this is the first time, we talked about under Shakespeare how we had all the roles were played by men, even the female roles. But at this point, they actually have actresses on the stage. So it's the first time women show up on the English stage, at least publicly like that. The plays at the time were often rather raunchy, as well as very witty. So there'd be a lot of sexual innuendo and, who's sleeping with who and who's having an affair with who and this sort of thing, to the extent where basically they were not played at all during the Victorian era and not really again until the 20th century. I've read some literature from this time period, and even by modern standards, some of it's pretty raunchy. Often quite funny too. But anyhow, a little bit later on, some of that more raunchiness gets toned down a bit, and the emphasis is more on being really refined in manners and in speech and also in literature. And satire becomes the predominant form of literature. It's known as the Age of Satire. And during this a little bit later period, like say from the 1690s through the mid-1700s, the most prominent English writers were Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift. Their main goal for literature was to criticize contemporary society, point out things that are wrong, and they used satire to do that. They would attack things like immorality and bad taste, as well as things they saw as politically a problem, and criticize manners and morals and bad literature and things like that, and point out ways that society was failing to live up to its ideals. So they'd talk about things like corrupt politicians, materialism, commercialism, as well as just kind of being too superficial. And they would do that with very highly refined, very witty comedies. Swift more in prose. He was a prose writer, and Pope more in poetry. And although I think both of them also, well, at least Pope, I believe, also wrote some plays, but his poetry is more known today. All right, journalism also really comes into its own at this time. Newspapers become a big thing, and some of the newspaper writers and journalists would do, they would also point out problems in society. Daniel Defoe, better known probably today for his book Robinson Crusoe, was at that time known at least as much for being a journalist and newspaper writer, and he would point out things that were conflicting with his values. And once again, these journalists, some other important ones were these guys named Addison and Steele, who would talk about how there was a lot of issues with either public taste or corruption and things like that. The poets at this time, and poetry is really, in many ways, probably the dominant form of literature at this time still, was known as public poetry. The idea of poetry just revealing the innermost feelings and being sort of a private journal, no, that's not really an ideal most of these poets held. It was more, we're going to look at they were very society focused. We're going to look at problems in society. We're going to write a highly crafted and very well turned out poem to point out these issues and to sort of serve as a public celebration. And so the public versus the private is really predominant. That really also goes to that cities are valued over kind of private country living in many ways. And the literature is focused on the cities and conversation in these coffee houses and things like that. So, all of this poetry, whether it be an elegy that celebrates a best about a person, whether it's satire, which is pointing out problems in society, odes, which are celebrating public emotion. And all of these are very public focused. I'm not saying you won't find private poetry at the time, you can, but most of the dominant poetry is more public focused at this time and more focused on wit and intellect than emotion and feeling, which becomes important later on. All right, so this is also when we see the first English novels. The early novels were typically in a form we would call a somewhat loose plot. Like it would just be, okay, here's all the stuff that happened to this fictional character, and kind of going along with them, and often very satirical and witty, but having a lot of conversation. So this is really when novels come into their own in English literature and start to become important as a literary form. During the later period that we're talking about, we're saying, say, the mid to late 1700s, this guy named Samuel Johnson becomes really, really prominent, and he tends to see restraint and balance as super important once again, and criticizes a lot of what he sees as bad taste in literature and also grammar. So he's very important. He also creates the first real good dictionary in the English language, which is quite important. And so towards the end of this time period, you see a bit of a reaction against this sort of mechanistic, rationalistic way of looking at the world, and you see this reaction starting to crop up that will eventually bloom into what we know as the Romantic era, which we'll talk about later on. And you see kind of a critique of some of the excesses of industrialism and things like that, and results of this mechanistic way of looking at the world towards the end of this period in the late 1700s. All right, and so that more or less wraps up what I wanted to talk to you about, the Restoration and Enlightenment period, and some of the major authors and the major movements in literature at the time. So it's a time of satire, a time of reason, a time of thinking of the world more or less as a machine, that if we just tune all the parts right, we'll have this happy and peaceful society. We may need to compromise, and we may need to be but we need to be very refined and very restrained in the way we do things. And that shows up also in the literature and what it's pointing out. So the literature is very satire focused, with a lot of pointing out problems in society, tuning the machine, if you will. And that's where we get a lot of our institutions of today come from this time period. The American Revolution happened towards the end of this time period. The American Constitution, Declaration of Independence, all show influences of this way of thinking. And the literature from the time period definitely shows the mark of this way of thinking as well. All right, so that pretty well wraps up my presentation.